Hello and welcome. As with many teachings within the Fourth Way tradition, the concept of inner unity requires that you get into the habit of observing yourself, observing your thoughts, words, and actions to see how this plays out in your own life. You are reminded that the average person lacks in this sort of self-awareness, and most people, when they start looking at themselves, find a completely different person than the one they thought they had been living with for their entire lives. Or, more accurately, several different people. And this state of affairs is what we are going to examine in this video. The framework of inner unity views the human psyche as inherently fragmented. We exist as a multitude of selves, each vying for control, often without our conscious awareness. To truly appreciate the scope of this, we must delve into the nature of these fragmented selves, the already mentioned practice of self-observation, the process of integration, and the ultimate surrender to a higher will. The Fourth Way's teachings highlight that, in our habitual state, we operate mechanically, often under the illusion of being cohesive, consistent beings. Yet, our internal reality tells a different story. Consider a moment when you feel determined to tackle a challenging task, full of clarity and drive. But then, unexpectedly, you become overwhelmed by doubt or distracted by unrelated thoughts. You may suddenly tell yourself things such as that it's not worth the effort, you're good where you are, it's probably not going to work anyway. And what you really need is a bit of doom, scrolling on the phone, and a bag of your favorite snacks. Then you can keep up with what is going on in the world and experience some pleasure, both at the same time. This sudden shift may seem random, but it reflects the influence of different selves taking control. These selves are not just reactive, but are shaped by a complex interplay of past experiences, ingrained habits, fluctuating emotions, and external triggers, usually acting without deliberate, conscious intention. This insight invites a deep reconsideration of our sense of identity. Gurdjieff's analogy likens us to a house in disarray, with various tenants coming and going, each claiming to be the master. In this state, our lives lack coherence, and we are pulled in multiple directions. The result is inner conflict and an inability to act with true agency. Recognizing this condition is not a cause for despair, but an opportunity to rise above the condition that most people unknowingly live under. It's important to recognize that various internal processes contribute to these experiences. The phrase, "the map is not the territory," reminds us that our perceptions and interpretations are not the same as reality itself. Distinguishing between the influence of different selves and the effects of neurological and hormonal fluctuations, as well as conflicting external messages, may be impossible. It may even be just two ways of describing the same state of affairs. Both perspectives align with the understanding that our sense of self is a complex construct influenced by multiple factors, both internal and external. What we can say for sure is that we undoubtedly are not thinking and acting in a coherent manner in our normal state, that we can want and think one thing in one instance and the opposite in the next, and that this state of affairs isn't obvious to us even when it's staring us right in the face. Thus, for this model to be useful, it's enough to recognize that we often desire completely different, contradictory things and assume different attitudes to the same things at different times, and that this is not something that we usually realize since, before reflecting consciously upon it, we live under the assumption that there is a coherence to our thoughts, emotions, words, and actions, which in turn gives off the illusion of a stable self. It is furthermore interesting to note that if we observe ourselves, it seems undeniable that there are different qualities to our wants, wishes, and desires. We seem to be more true to ourselves in some instances than others, and some individuals seem more genuinely put together than others. To use a worn-out example, there seems to be a different quality to the will inside us that tells us to consider the long-term consequences of our decisions, and the will that tells us to go after momentary pleasures, even though both may, and in all likelihood will, argue their respective cases, and the arguments may sound more or less convincing depending on what overall state you're in. Can you see how this works? When you're not conscious, your internal state, rather than what is most in line with your true wishes and values, will determine what thoughts you listen to. Total inner unity is difficult to cultivate, and, as you can see, it's a somewhat elusive concept, which is something that many concepts are once you start picking them apart, by the way. Thus, this is not the primary aim here. Instead, the first crucial step is to separate oneself from these often chaotic inner processes, and instead get into an observer mode, where we don't have to succumb to the will of every self that makes its desires known. We do this so that we can make intentional choices in spite of the war that often rages inside. If you think that this reminds you of acceptance and commitment therapy, you're right. In ACT, our inner life is also often likened to a war, and what we need to do is simply to recognize that we don't have to participate in it. We can simply take a step back and watch it. This is crucial, as this is an important step towards inner peace and clarity. Thus, the first and most critical step on this journey is, as more or less always in the fourth way teachings, self-observation. This practice requires cultivating a neutral, non-judgmental awareness of oneself. It is not about changing behavior, but about noticing it, acknowledging the ebb and flow of thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations without interference. Through consistent self-observation, patterns emerge, revealing the multifaceted nature of the psyche. One begins to see the distinct selves at play and the triggers that summon the selves. For example, you might notice how anger arises in interactions with certain people during certain circumstances, but not during others. If you want to know more in depth about self-observation, we have a whole video on the subject, and there will be a link to it at the end screen. Self-observation is challenging because it demands honesty and vigilance. We are not accustomed to observing ourselves without bias. The ego, seeking to maintain its illusions, resists this scrutiny. Yet, with persistence, self-observation deepens, shining a light on the hidden mechanisms of the psyche. This practice lays the groundwork for the next phase, integration. This is, in essence, de-identification with your internal processes, as the understanding that if you can have completely different thoughts about a person, phenomenon, or object depending on a variety of reasons, they can logically not be an expression of who you are. Now, integration involves harmonizing the various selves into a unified whole. The goal is to align them under the central, observing presence that we've been talking about. In the fourth way, this central presence is often called the master or observing self. It is a stabilizing force, capable of mediating the internal cacophony and guiding actions with coherence and purpose. This observing self is neutral when experienced without distortions. It's free from desires and can therefore make choices with detachment, in alignment with divine guidance instead of the ego's wants, wishes, and desires. This also means that it's good to ask ourselves what we truly want, because most people are not very aware of this. Having clearly defined aims and values helps us not to be subject to the whims of the different wills inside. The journey toward inner unity is not a solitary one. It unfolds within the broader context of relationships, work, and daily life. The fourth way teaches that these external circumstances are not obstacles, but opportunities. Every interaction, every challenge, becomes a mirror reflecting the state of one's inner world, and no matter where we are and what situation we are in, we can always wake up, become conscious, and intentionally choose to pay attention to what is going on in and around us. For example, moments of conflict with others often reveal unresolved conflicts within, and if we pay attention, we can see just how much of our behavior is governed by other motivations than those we tell ourselves. By observing and working through these reflections, one deepens the process of integration. Moreover, the path to inner unity is not merely personal, it's universal. The fourth way emphasizes the interconnectedness of all beings. True unity within reflects and contributes to unity without. This perspective aligns with the idea that human development is not an isolated endeavor, but part of a larger cosmic order. As we harmonize our internal worlds, we align ourselves with the broader harmony of existence. An interesting observation that you will make after a while is also that most of your behavior, just like most of your thoughts, just happens. You are not really in control. Where you are in control is in those moments where you make choices, set intentions, or reflect consciously and with intention over something. And even then, it's debatable how much control you have, since your choices are determined by countless unknown inner and outer factors. This is, again, why observing yourself to simply uncover what has priorly been hidden is so important. A conclusion that can be drawn from this, and you do what you want with it, is that this, in the end, is about surrendering what we find to something higher, whether you believe that this higher is within yourself or an external force, such as God, or both. Depending on your disposition, you may have to turn this one around in your head a few times before you decide what to do with it. But surrender does have its place within the fourth way, even though different teachers seem to look upon it in different ways. It is perhaps the most paradoxical aspect of the work. It requires an active effort to cultivate self-awareness and intentionality, yet it culminates in letting go of self-will. This is not a negation of self, but a transcendence of the fragmented ego. In this state, the observing self becomes a vessel for the divine or universal will. Actions arise not from personal desires or fears, but from a place of alignment with the greater whole. To understand this involves the aforementioned understanding that most real self-development happens on a largely unconscious level. In this context, we shine a light on previously hidden aspects of our psyche, and the mere act of observing ourselves as clearly as possible creates a powerful shift within. The difficulty then is not about struggling to change ourselves with our minds, it's rather to relinquish control, trusting that these processes unfold as they should, while we don't away from the lessons that life inevitably teaches us. It's also making tough decisions at those times when we see our choices clearly. It's clear what course of action is most beneficial, no matter how much our egos try to convince us otherwise, and we feel that we are capable of making those decisions. In conclusion, the quest for inner unity in the fourth way tradition is a profound and multifaceted endeavor. It begins with the recognition of our inner fragmentation and unfolds through the practices of self-observation, integration, and surrender. It challenges us to move beyond mechanical existence into conscious being, to harmonize the diverse voices within, and to align ourselves with a higher order. This journey is deeply transformative, and it offers a path to live with intentionality, authenticity, and grace, contributing not only to our own evolution, but to the evolution of all. Finally, a quick reminder that the map is not the territory. We are talking about a way of conceptualizing an inner phenomenon to make it more tangible. What processes are moving beneath the surface is difficult to know, and the exact knowledge of this would not be practically useful. Inner unity seems to rather be something that follows naturally from our recognition of ourselves as parts of something infinitely bigger than our little ego selves. Here, our job seems to be primarily to recognize our normal disorder and all the many quote-unquote demons that lurk inside our minds. Then, we simply take a step away from it, see it for what it is, and decide to let it go. Finally, we seek a more objective view of ourselves and gradually allow our inner pieces to fall into place as we surrender to the higher within. You've now reached the end of the video. Remember to like and subscribe. Thank you for your time.